Amen. Thanks, Melissa. Hey, we're going to kind of dive right in because you guys, who had a great time in their small group? Who spilled a lot of popcorn? Any of you? Those guys did, yeah. But who cleaned it up? Who cleaned it up nice? Yeah, good job. Hey, but we're going to kind of dive in. Hey, guys. Remember, when we're here, we kind of lock in, pay attention, be like 15 minutes, and then we'll turn to some other stuff. But this is a time as we open God's Word to really lock in and pay attention. And I just want to, I don't always do it this way, but I want to dive right in because you guys already spent time in small groups tonight. One of the questions in your guide, if you got to that, was this thing of anxiety. Melissa talked about it, and I know this is a risky question, but I want to see if anybody has the courage to answer. What is something, it doesn't have to be you, but something in your group, if you feel like they'd be comfortable with you sharing, what's something that causes you to be anxious or to worry? What did you guys say? Anything? Yeah, just shout it out really loud. Grades, the future, sports. Friends, yeah. Who's on social media? Did that come up in your circles? Yeah. Who has a cell phone? Did that come up in your circles? It came up on my circle for you. But, we're going to be talking really directly about that. If you guys are new with us, maybe this is one of your first times here. We've been, like Melissa said, in this series in the book of Philippians. It's really all about joy. And we've talked about how it can be pretty easy to be joyful when things kind of go our way, right? But really, that isn't always the case, is it? Sometimes some really hard things happen in our lives. But if joy is a decision that you make and not just a feeling that you have when things are good and when things go your way, then that means this whole time we've been talking that you can be joyful even when unexpected or challenging or stressful things in life happen. Because joy doesn't come from your circumstances. Joy comes from being in a relationship with Jesus, who loves you, who died for you, who gives you and offers you full life in him. You can choose to experience joy because really joy has way more to do with who God is and what he's done in your life than it does with what's happening out there, or even than it does with what's happening in here. And that's what we're going to really talk about here tonight. Camping out on this idea of what does it look like to experience joy even when worry and anxiety and those kinds of things start to creep in to our minds. So we're going to pick up in Philippians. You guys maybe read this in your group. Maybe you didn't have a chance to get there yet, but we're going to pick up in verse 6 in the NIV. I know I've got some slide stuff going on there, but here's what it says. Paul writes, "Do not be anxious." And let me just pause there because my guess is that for some of you, that verse feels sort of loaded. So hang with me for a second because I first want to explain something really important, okay? Everybody, if you're not turned and looking at me, let's position our chairs, look at me, and let's talk, okay? So I want to explain something to you, okay? There is a difference between clinical anxiety and having anxious thoughts. There is some similarity, but they're not the same thing all the time. One is a mental health condition, anxiety. That is something that might require professional help, doctors, medicine. And can I just say to you, if that is true for you or somebody you know, there is no shame in that. It's really important stuff that we take really seriously. But all of us experience like everyday normal worries. And that's really more what we're talking about here tonight. In fact, the NLT translates this same verse. Paul says, don't worry about anything. Now, I want to be clear. Paul says, don't worry. He does not say that as a Christian or as a middle school student in Access that you will never experience worries. We all worry about stuff. That's like a totally normal human thing that we do. But Paul's encouragement here is less about what not to do and more about what we should do. So if you keep reading in that verse, he says, don't worry about anything. Instead, or in other words, here's what you should do. Pray about everything. Tell God what you need and thank him for all that he has done. Paul here is saying that when you worry, not if, but when you experience worry, that you don't have to give in to that thought. You have the opportunity where you can do something with it. I like to think about it like you can redirect it. I've heard it said, like you can almost think about anxiety as a worry that you haven't done anything with, like an unchecked worry, something you haven't dealt with before. And what that means is that when you begin to experience worry, and that is a totally normal thing that, again, each and every one of us have dealt with, when you begin to have those thoughts, the question should be, what do I do with that thought? Do I let it kind of take over? Do I let it run like crazy on repeat in my mind? Do I let it stick to me and even kind of sink deep within me? I had a conversation this week that I was really, really anxious about. And I, honestly, last weekend, I spent much of the time, like I was cutting the grass, thinking about what would happen in that conversation. And I don't know if you've ever done this, but I was just like imagining all the worst case scenarios. Like if they said this, or if this happens, if they respond this way, like what will I do? And I got to this like really crazy, like looking back, that would never happen. But it was really, really easy, maybe you've experienced that, for my brain to just like fill in all of those gaps and for my mind to end up in a really, really crazy place as I just stirred on all of those thoughts. And if you've experienced that, you probably know that is exhausting, right? Like physically, emotionally, spiritually, I felt worn out, honestly, like this time last week. And so that conversation was coming up, and I had a conversation with my mentor. We talked a lot about mentorship last week. This is one of the guys that I talk with like every month that encourages me and coaches me, and I told him about what I was thinking and feeling, and this is what he said. I think this is a direct quote. He said, bro, that's how he talks. Do you know anybody that talks like that? Like, bro. He said, bro, calm down. Like, chill out. And then he asked me a question. He said, have you prayed about it? And I was like, well, I mean, yeah. And I kind of, sputtered, and he just like cut me off and said, bro, that's how he talks. Bro, you have to give that to God. Guys, that is what Paul is saying here in these verses, that if anxiety is you just talking to yourself about all of your problems, then prayer is you giving your problems and your anxieties to God. Because again, let's pull that verse 6 in the NLT if you can, the one with the red. There you go. Don't worry about anything. Instead, pray about everything. Tell God what you need and thank him for all that he has done. Let me just say three quick things on this. First, God cares about what you are going through. Whether it feels really, really big or really, really small, like should I even pray about it? God cares about what you're going through. He sees you, and he wants you to give those things to him, to trust him with it. But two, just because you pray about that stuff does not mean that God's just going to give you whatever you want, right? He's not a genie in a bottle. His ways are higher than our ways, and so he doesn't promise to change it exactly the way that you want it to be changed. And that maybe if you're like me, you need that reminder sometimes. And three, praying about it, I think there's a typo in there, that's on me, but praying about everything, often, I think that takes multiple reps, like multiple times. It's very uncommon in my life, at least, to have a worry, and I pray about it, I give it to God, and then boom, gone forever. The rest of my life, I never think or worry. Like, it's really way more common where I honestly bring my anxiety to God, and I trust him with it, and then later on, another thought, maybe even the same thought, pops up into my brain, usually the same thought, and then what happens? Like I have to get to the place where I, again, am reminded, I don't need to deal with that on my own. I can trust God with it. Here's the promise that he offers after verse 6. In verse 7, for verse 6, he says, pray about everything. And in verse 7, he says, then you will experience God's peace, which exceeds anything we can understand. His peace will guard your hearts and your minds as you live in Christ Jesus. Do you guys know where peace comes from? I think often it's easy for us to kind of associate peace and happiness. Like I'm going to be at peace if everything in life is good and if I'm super, super happy. But here's what Jesus says about this in the Gospel of John. He says, I've told you all of this so that you may have peace in me. Here on earth you will have many trials and sorrows, but take heart because I have overcome the world. See, guys, when you're in a relationship with Jesus, he offers you a peace that can only be found in him, which means that even though you will still face challenging things in your life, some of the stuff you guys already said out loud and listed earlier, if you know Jesus and turn to him with those things, he promises to give you peace, a peace that you can't even comprehend or understand. And because that's the case, Paul offers one final thought here in verse 8. He says, fix your thoughts on what is true and honorable and right and pure and lovely and admirable. Think about the things that are excellent and worthy of praise. And this is kind of how I picture what Paul is saying here in this verse and really this whole passage, right? That we all have all sorts of like thoughts and worries and stuff that comes and pops into our mind. And sometimes it kind of looks a little bit like this. And the question is, what am I going to do with that thought? Is it going to be like the story I told earlier where I just like kind of stir on it and think about it and go to all these worst case scenarios? Like, will I let that thought control me? Because I think oftentimes that's what it wants to do. And if you leave it unchecked, I think often what happens is when you have a worry or an anxious thought, it naturally will rise. Right? It'll naturally go up and kind of take over your mind and take over your heart and take over your life. And oftentimes, if you've experienced that, like it leads to kind of dangerous and unhealthy, like bad places. Or when a thought comes into my mind, will I take action? Instead of dwelling on it and stirring on it, will I recognize it? And instead of doing those things, will I grab it and will I redirect it? Will I give it to God and say, God, this is a thought that came into my mind. I don't want to think about that anymore. God, I give this thought to you, and instead, God, would you replace that thought with something that is honorable and pure and all the things that he says there in verse 8. And do you know what happens? Oftentimes, another thought pops into your mind. And sometimes, like I said earlier, even the same thought from before pops back into your mind. And again, you have a choice. What do? You kind of repeat the same cycle, right? You grab that thought and say, God, I don't want to think about this anymore. I give it to you. God, change my mind. This is sometimes harder than it looks, guys, which is a good metaphor. And then what happens again? Same cycle. God, here's a thought that popped into my mind. God, take this thought from me, change my mind. I don't want to think like this anymore. And then boom, it happens again and then again and again. And the same cycle continues to happen. It doesn't mean everything in life is super peaceful and easy just because you've done this once. It often happens again and again and again. And sometimes even when you don't expect it to. But do you know what happens? You know what you're doing when you do that? You're building habits. It doesn't, like I said, it doesn't mean everything's perfect and fine and dandy in your life, but you're building really healthy habits and you're growing in your trust in Jesus as you continue to give those things to him and allow him to take that from you. And do you know what Jesus promises in return? Anybody remember? Peace. Joy's a good answer too. I think increasingly you experience a peace and a joy that you can't fully explain. You know, I talked to some high school kids about like the anxiety that they face, kind of the same thing I did with you. I talked to some of them this week. And they shared a lot of really similar things. And Sarah stood right where I am and shared the same stuff as a senior in high school, all the things she's going through. Social media, the future, you know, this idea that you have to be so busy to be valuable or whatever. And I just think maybe more than any generation, you guys, even as middle school students, are facing anxiety in like just uniquely challenging ways, different than what we've experienced maybe before, every single day. And can I just say to you guys as one of your pastors, that's really, really hard. Like I see that, and I think your leaders see that, and on behalf of them too, I just want to say, like if you're in a place where you feel like balloons are popping every single minute of every single day, I am so sorry. That's so challenging. But also, please hear me when I say this, that no matter how big your anxiety feels, God is bigger than that. He is with you. He is for you. He asks you, give me those things. I'll take them from you. And then in return, not only will I take it off your plate, but I'll also give you peace. A peace that will guard your heart and will guard your mind. So I want to end this time, and then we'll still do the huddle group in a few minutes, but I want to end this time by doing a really simple exercise. I think it's part of this conversation, it's really important to recognize that you give these things to God, but also this happens in community with one another. And so there's a slide that's going to come up onto the screen, and I've got 30 seconds to explain it. I want you to find a buddy next to you, your leader, a friend in your group, whatever. Don't move, just turn. Find a group of two. Person one, share one balloon, one worry. Person two, pray for person one, and then reverse. Person two shares, person one prays. You have 30 seconds each. It's all on the screen. In 2 minutes, we'll come back together, and then we'll turn off to our huddle groups. 3, 2, 1, go.